Building guitar necks, part 3. Install your fret wire. Prep each slot beforehand with a triangular file to add a chamfer to the top of the cut. You're not going too deep, you're just adding a lead in so the wire is easier to install. Then, prior to installing the wire, add a small amount of super glue to the tang of the fret. Hammer the wire in. Don't go too hard, you're not hammering a nail, you're just tapping it into the neck. And you'll notice I'm supporting the neck under the area where I'm hammering. Trim the fret ends with fret end cutters. Trim as close to the neck as you can, and be careful as the fret ends will be sharp. Glue the crown of each of the frets. Use a permanent marker to add color to the top of each fret. This is similar to using Dicom in a machining process. I jumped the gun a little bit before starting the leveling. I should have taken my ruler with notches cut out to confirm that the neck is flat. I'm shining light behind it and making sure that along the fretboard I can't see any light between the ruler and the wood of the fretboard. After doing that, use a leveling file or a leveling beam with sandpaper on it and remove the tops of the frets until there is no more marker showing on top of them. After you do that, coat them again with your marker. And level them one more time. This is just a quick double check that they are as flat as you think they are. Starting at the 15th fret, glue the crown of the frets until you get to the end of the fretboard. Add some masking tape over the next fret. This is to protect it as you sand away the fall off. This will ensure that when you're playing the higher notes that there will be no buzzing when you play. Then mask the wood. I'm just using some masking tape for the higher frets. I do cut the tape lengthwise to get it in between those smaller spaces. Again, color the top of all your frets. And with the crowning file, begin to shape the crown of the fret, removing a little bit of material from each side until that black mark that you put on is just a very thin line centered on the fret. This is where the intonation of each fret will stay. With some sandpaper, I think this is 800 or 600, go over the tops of the frets. This will just help round over and remove some of those marks from the file. Then remove your masking tape. And using the same file, bring in the fret ends so that they're flush to the wood of the fingerboard. This will make sure you don't cut yourself as you play. Make sure you get those tangs all the way down to the wood. While you do this, you could also add the bevel, the angle at the end of each fret. And mask your frets again. Now we can begin polishing the frets. I'm using some fret rubbers, which is an abrasive suspended in a rubber material. And we're going through starting with the coarse and removing the marks from the files and from the sandpaper. Start coarse, then work to medium, fine, and super fine until your frets are polished. You could also end with some steel wool, quadruple zero. Then mark the tuner locations. From the edge of the fretboard, add a pencil mark an 1/8 inch in, then with a very long ruler, extend it out to the headstock and draw your lines. Then eyeball the location from the end of the headstock to where you'd like your center holes to be. I have a drilling jig for this. Then drill out your machine holes. Those small dents in the headstock are from when I hammered in a drill bit earlier to mark the center of each of those hole locations. And don't worry about being too rough. You don't have to be delicate at this stage because everything can be sanded out as long as you don't take a chunk out of your neck. You'll see him hammering in the dowels to hold that piece in place. The high E-string hole didn't quite line up exactly perfect, so I'm drilling another hole and placing the dowel there. I should really be using a different drill bit, so I did have some small amount of tear out, but this won't be noticeable under the flange of the tuning machines. And I also preserved some sawdust to fill in any chunks I may take out. The camera did not work when recording, making the nut blank, but I ordered a piece of bone and on a leveling beam sanded it back and forth until it just fit into that slot, and I ended up with the rectangle that you see here. Then from each end of that, 1/8 inch in, mark a very fine pencil line. Then with a string gauge, a string spacing ruler, mark the center of each fret. Across the top, score a small line using a razor file. I also laid a feeler gauge across the upper 3 frets and traced a pencil line from the top of that gauge along the nut so I can stop at the correct depth. Don't saw too deep because you could always remove material, you can't always add it. And using the razor saw for the E and B string slots, just cut down to just above that line. Then using gauged slotting files, proceed to the next strings. You can likely find a file that is perfect for each gauge of string that you prefer. I'm making this to accept the custom sets of Diodario NYXL strings that I use. These slots are also not parallel to the fretboard. The bridge side of the nut sits a little bit higher up than the headstock side of the nut on the slot. Take your time and make sure that the slots that you cut will allow the string to glide freely inside of that nut. Then radius your nut. With a leveling beam and sandpaper, I'm sanding back that nut to about where half of one string diameter of slot is left, if that makes sense. Next, drill your tuner locating holes. The back of each tuner has a small peg that sits inside that wood to ensure that your tuner does not rotate in the hole. So what I have is 2 drill jigs. I install them into the holes for the tuners, and I lay a ruler across the 2 of them, and this will ensure that all my tuners across the headstock will be level with each other. And I'll repeat this for all the holes. The locating holes in these jigs are slightly smaller than the pegs of my tuners, so I will go back after with a slightly larger bit and open those up a little bit. Always be careful to not go too deep and drill through the headstock. If you do, you can repair it. Always save some scrap wood, and what you do is you make some sawdust with it by sanding it, fill the hole with that wood dust, and then flood the hole with super glue, cover it back over again with sawdust, let it dry, and then sand it back. And because you're filling the hole with the same wood that the hole was drilled into, it's pretty close to invisible. After that, you can wet sand. What you do is spray a paper towel, or just wet a paper towel with water. Wipe it all over your neck and body. And what that does is it raises the wood grain. The fibers will stand on end. And then go over that with a piece of sandpaper. I forget what I'm using here. I think this is 800 grit. And you want to do this 2 times, 3 times maybe, to really make sure you have a super smooth surface prior to finish. Certain finishes you want to go a little bit rougher and stop around 320, 400 grit.